have a little better session. Thanks, guys. So my name is Britton Zerker. I'm a program manager. I work with the MEDV engineering team. For those that aren't familiar with MEDV, it stands for Microsoft Enterprise Desktop Virtualization. And today in this session, we're going to talk about how MEDV can enable your organization to quickly move and accelerate your moves from Windows XP to Windows 7. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. All right. I can kind of stay to this side of the room. People over here, I'll kind of ignore you then. Okay. So let's talk about the session objective. So what we want you to do is we want you to walk out of here understanding exactly what MEDV is, what's new in version 2. So some of you might be familiar with V1, might even be using it, so you'll have a good understanding of what the version 2 product provides that was released on March 10th. You understand what the deployment strategies are, what we recommend, what are some of the best practices, and you'll see the seamless user experience and how you can leverage your existing infrastructure, what you have today, your ESD, to deploy and manage your MEDV installation. So let's keep moving forward. We're going to time slice this. We've got about an hour. So the first part will give you an overview of the product, help you understand what the application compatibility problem is in the enterprise. We'll talk about how many of you have those problems, and we'll talk about what solution Microsoft has to help you with that. And then we'll get into the meat of the presentation, where we'll actually go through the steps that you'll take all the way from creating your MEDV image down to what the end user experience is like, and we'll have demos all through those that will give you a good overview of what that's like. And then finally, we'll try to wrap up a little earlier to get you out to your parties, your dinner appointments. We'll have a wrap-up and a Q&A. So that's how we'll proceed. So let's start with our overview. So just with a show of hands, how many of you are in the process in your organization, either yourselves or in your organization, moving from Windows XP to Windows 7? Okay, it's pretty much the entire room. So keep those hands raised. How many of you are having problems or barriers that are preventing that to happen as soon as you'd like? Okay, the same hands stay up. So at least we know our audience. We all are having issues. We're trying to get to Windows 7 as quickly as possible. So as we've talked to our customers, and as we've involved them in our beta and TAP programs, we've kind of collected a list of the kinds of problems and barriers that are affecting our customers. And you know what? We learn new things all the time. Even being here at TechEd and being at the MEDV booth, we hear some pretty bizarre stories on what's blocking them. But let's talk about some of the general problems. So the first thing is, most of you have been using MEDV for about a decade. And you've been collecting a lot of applications, and you may not have a full inventory of everything that's out there. So it's going to take you and your department time to get an inventory of all those applications. You'll then have to make sure that you test them. And testing is going to be a real cost, not just for your team, but it's also going to be for your other department heads. You'll have to go to them and find out what applications they're going to miss when you move to Windows 7. So it's a drain of time and money on your organization to get those applications. So over the last 10 years, we know a lot of you have been developing on a platform that isn't going to work in Windows 7 based on IE6. And so those applications are going to be a problem as you move to Windows 7. There are things that just won't work. Maybe you have a 16-bit application or some application that just isn't going to work in Windows 7. Sometimes you've given all of your users administrator privileges in XP, and you've done away with that policy in Windows 7, but you have some applications that require that. And so there are things that just aren't going to work for you. And then finally, maybe the contractor or even the ISV is no longer available to fix your applications and get them prepared. So it's just a lot and a diverse set. Maybe these are what you're facing. There may be others, but there's a lot of things that are blocking our customers. The bottom line is, it's keeping you from one of the main benefits of moving to Windows 7, and that is your bottom line. You can get your costs down by moving as quickly as possible. So with MEDV v2, you can run your legacy Windows XP and IE apps, and it breaks down these barriers and allows you to move to Windows 7 from Windows XP much sooner and much more seamlessly than you would have been able to otherwise. So let's look at it another way. We look at the project that many of you are facing. We'll look at the project timeline from the day that you actually started and said, we have a goal, we're going to move to Windows 7 in our desktop, to when you finished, where that last desktop has been migrated, you're completely off Windows XP. We look at the other axis. These are your applications that you know are required within your organization. That to be complete, you're going to have 100% coverage in order to move that first machine. So many of you are at the step where you've determined that a certain amount of your applications will just work. they'll come right over to Windows 7 and work just as they did in XP without anything from you. And that's probably a pretty good percentage for many of you. For the remaining apps, the ones that won't work, we call this and identify this as the compatibility gap. And we've talked about some of the barriers, what's causing those problems, so we've listed them here. What Medvi does, it will step in and it will run those incompatible apps in your Windows 7 desktops and fill that gap, allowing you from almost day one to be able to deploy to Windows 7 even though you haven't mitigated all of those incompatibilities. As time goes on, you'll find that you're going to retire some, that you'll be able to upgrade some. Maybe you had budget and you'll be able to purchase the right version. Maybe you'll have budget and you'll have some people work on them, but that gap will still exist and Medvi will be there. And time will go on and that gap will get smaller and smaller. You'll use shims. We've got some great sessions around how you can actually get applications to work in Windows 7, but you'll still have that gap and Medvi will be there all along the way until the point where you can actually say, okay, our last app's been migrated. We can now pull Medvi off of our systems, and that's really what our product team wants to happen. We're one of the few companies, or one of the few products in Microsoft that says, we don't want you to run us for the next 10 years. We really want you to move off as quickly as possible, and that's what we do, is from day one, we'll fill that gap until you don't need us anymore, and then you'll pull us back. Okay, so let's move on. So we know that Medvi runs legacy applications in Windows 7. It provides a great user experience, and we'll demo that and talk about it, but things like printer sharing, and USB support and some of the great features that were added in V2 we'll talk about in a second. I have a customer quote here you're probably already reading. And Alex participated in our TAP program and he went through beta and they were really excited about Medvi because they didn't have to worry about closing that gap too early. They didn't have to worry about getting budget and worried about the time frame. They could just move as quickly as possible. They were excited and they're well on their way to being completely off of Windows XP in their environment. So let's talk about some of the other application compatibility products from Microsoft that are out there. Many of you might be familiar with XP Mode. It's based on Windows Virtual PC, and it ships with every premium SKU of Windows 7, and it provides a great user experience. However, it's a standalone application, and it requires the user to be somewhat technical savvy. It has no enterprise management capabilities and really isn't suited for a full deployment in enterprise. Some of you might be familiar with Medvi V1. And we know that's based on older technology. It came out in the Vista timeframe, and so it's not quite as performant as XP mode would be, but it has some good enterprise features, and we have some customers that are successfully using Medvi V1 to mitigate their application compatibility today. Medvi V2, however, marries the great technology, Windows Virtual PC of XP mode, plus some of the enterprise management capability of the V1 product, plus some new enhancements, and really provides the enterprise solution for application compatibility. And we'll go ahead and prove that as we go through the demos and talk more about how you use it. So let's jump over now to a demo machine. Wrong one. And before we talk about the admin experience, what you're going to experience as you prepare and get ready for deployment and start managing those things, let's talk about what the end user looks like. So just a standard day for an end user. It's been deployed to the user, and they've already configured it, so it's already up and running. And what the user will see, in the bottom right-hand corner, you see that there's a system tray. We'll get a little closer on that because that's pretty far out. And that's really all the user will see, is that little tray icon that tells them they have compatibility apps that are ready for them to use. One UI that you can provide to your users, and this can be disabled if you don't want your users to make this choice, but there's two choices for how the Medvi virtual machine runs. So we are running a virtual machine within Windows Virtual PC that's running Windows XP. And so your users have two choices. They can choose to do fast start, or maybe you as an IT pro, you can also deliver this as policy for your entire organization. But in fast start, that VM is always running. So if you have users that are constantly going to be using their applications and need to launch them quickly, you'd run fast start. And the apps will launch in a few seconds, but it will always be running there, taking up that certain amount of resource on the user's machine. If, on the other hand, you have users that may not be constantly using their incompatible apps in Windows 7, maybe just occasionally, you may want to go with normal start. And what normal start does is it will hibernate. If you know anything about virtual machines, it will hibernate that virtual machine, and it will be woken up when the user attempts to launch an incompatible application. And so that way it will save the resources when the user doesn't need it, and it will launch when the user needs it. The one drawback to that is it will take about 20 to 30 seconds to wake that machine up and to see that app As long as your users are trained on that, then normal start would be acceptable. For most users, though, we would recommend you go with fast start. I think you'll find the performance in Windows Virtual PC is acceptable to run it in that mode. So in this case, I'm running in fast start. So my VM is spun up and ready to go. So looking at the end user experience, I don't have to go to any special place or any special menu. The applications that you'll publish to that Windows XP workspace are published right in my start menu. I have one here that is a Windows XP app that does not run in Windows 7. It's called Contoso Orders. And you can see it looks just like any native application I'd have in Windows 7. And up it pops. You can see that I can interact with it just like I would a native application. It has the Windows XP Chrome. You can see our famous Luna theme around that. But this is a good example of how the app looks and users can interact with it. So you'll push down other applications and you'll treat that virtual machine just like physical. As you try to mitigate new apps, you can push them down to the user and they'll automatically be published in their start menu. So let me show you one feature here. I've got another application called XML Notepad. And I actually have XML Notepad. I have it installed both virtually. You can see as I hover over that, it tells me it's virtual. And I have it installed natively. And you can see that the Medvi product automatically took care of that collision and lets the user know that one is virtual and one's native. So you may have applications that you have a legacy version that they'll have to run that corresponds with a native one, and you can put them side by side, and Medvi will take care of that collision. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the legacy version. And up it comes. So let me point out a few features here. One of the great things is that as your users interact with their legacy applications, and they choose their file chooser, they're not going to interact with files within that VM. They're actually using folder redirection technology. They're actually interacting with the files within their own paths. So my documents corresponds to the document paths within Windows 7 in this particular host. And so as they open and interact and save files, you don't have to educate the user and tell them that they have to make sure they save files on their host system because you're not backing up the XP guest. They'll just see them. And they'll all be there. They'll be familiar to the user. Likewise, if you have an application that has a file type association, in this case maybe a .xml file, and you have that legacy application published, the user double-clicks on an XML file in the host in Windows 7, it'll automatically launch that incompatible app, that legacy application for the user without them thinking about it. Likewise, printers. So you may have spent a lot of time getting those host system, those Windows 7 machines with the right printers, or maybe your users install their own printers. There's a seamless feature where it'll automatically take the host printers and install and map them in the guest. So when they go to a file print menu in a legacy application or browser, they'll actually see the printers that were installed on the host. There's nothing that you as the administrator or the end user has to do to get those running. So some great features and integrations around those. That does not work in reverse. So our guidance around that is you'd want to install on the host and let those get published to the guest. But good question. So let's look at one of the other. Another question? Okay. Let's look at one of the other features. Many of you have IE6 applications that won't work in Windows 7. And so rather than have the user make the choice or have to train them to say, you need to launch your Medvi browser when you go to this site, you as administrator will control a list that you can maintain, publish new sites, take them away for those websites that you need to run an IE6. And to the end user, they can launch their IE8 or IE9 browser in the host, and once they put in a URL that you've designated, and it matches it with you, up will pop up the IE6 browser with that site already loaded for the user. And you can see that in this particular case, I have it in a special security mode where we've disabled the address bar and put it on high security so that the user will interact with that application, not continue to work in it and maybe go to sites outside of your network and cause a security risk. But as soon as they're done with it, they'll treat it like an application, they'll close it down, and they'll be back to their secure and performant IE8 or IE9 browser in the host. So that's another great feature for the user. Any questions about the user demo before I move on? Yes? Okay. Okay, you're saying this is a Microsoft product that does this? The 4 zones. Oh, okay. Yes. So you're asking me about policy for the browser. So yes, we have it on high security when we do that for you in the setup, but if you're doing it through group policy, you may want to, however you're managing the group policy for your machines, you may want to push a different policy for your MedV workspaces. And you can do that if you're using Config Manager. You can set up collections, for example, and there's probably other ways that you can do it, but you probably wouldn't want to apply the same policy to your host systems as you would to your guests. I can talk to you more about that after the session. Okay, thanks for the question. Okay, so let's move on from the demo. So let's take a quick look at what the MedV architecture looks like. So obviously we're running Windows Virtual PC, so you'll start with an XP image, and we'll get more into that creation process in a moment. And we have a utility for administrators. It's called the Packager utility, and you'll input that image, and you'll configure it with your options. It will then spit out the files necessary for you to deploy that, and like we talked about, there's no infrastructure that you need for deployment. You'll use your ESD, Config Manager, or whatever it is that you happen to be using, and you'll push that out to your endpoint devices. So let's take a look at the endpoint. On the endpoint, you already have your ESD agent, whether it's Config Manager or be what it is. You'll have IE8 or 9. You want to make sure that Windows Virtual PC is available, and that is a core Windows technology that you can install. You'll then push down the host agent, which is the MedV host agent, which will install a browser helper object in the IE8 or IE9 browser to do the redirection. And then you'll push down your workspace to Windows Virtual PC. This will be your XP workspace. If we take a closer look at that, you'll see that inside the virtual machine, it's running Windows XP SP3. You'll also have an ESD agent that you can communicate with and push down software and policy, etc. And you'll have either IE6 or IE7, depending on your needs. And you'll have a guest agent that would have been installed by the MedV host agent. And so as you find applications that need to be mitigated, you'll use your ESD, you'll push those down to the guest ESD, which will then automatically and seamlessly be published to the host for the user to access using the RDP protocol remote app, for those of you familiar with that RDS service. Okay? No, that will automatically install itself once you have the host. The question was, is the agent for the XP3 guest, is it automatically installed, or is it installed, or do I have to install it? The answer was it's automatically installed once you have the host software on the Windows 7 machine. Question over here. You'll need to install the full product. It's not as big as you think or as big of a process, and we'll talk about that in a moment. If your question's not answered, you can bring it back up, okay? So now we're going to get into what the lifecycle management is. So this should be the bulk of what it's going to be like for you and your organization to actually work with and deploy MedV. So let's start with the creation. So this is when we're actually talking about the image. So we'll start with Windows XP SP3. That's the supported version of XP. And you want to make sure that it runs in Windows Virtual PC. You can't take a Hyper-V image, for example, and have that run. You need to configure and have it running in Windows Virtual PC. You want to make sure it gets all the updates. You're going to then install the MedV requirements, and this gentleman may answer your question here. So you want to install the integration components, which is available with Windows Virtual PC. You'll put that in your image. You want to have .NET 3.5 SP1, which is what is required to run the MedV software. And then you'll want to make sure that you have your third-party applications, likely your ESD client, your protection, and those types of things. Did that help your question, or did you have a different one? Okay. So as we talk to customers about creating the image, some of them get a little confused about, what are some of the best practices? What are the things that I need to do to make sure my image is created in the manner the product was designed for? So I've got a few tips here. Our documentation will go into much more detail on these things, but let's talk about them. The first thing is you're going to have that image, and the packager will compress it for you, but it will be quite large. And you may not be used, depending on what applications you're pushing around, you may not be used to pushing those around. But we found that with SP3 and .NET 3.5.1, if you put nothing else on that image, you can get it down to just under 2 gigs. So depending on how you're doing it, it's going to be at least that size. So you need to make sure that you get in there and delete as much as you can, including the page file. If you've installed the service packs in the conventional way, you can pull off the restore points for those, and there's a lot of things you can do. Make sure you get that as trim as possible. You then want to make sure that you install this patch. You can download this presentation if you need the link, but this patch will greatly improve the folder redirection performance. So the thing that I demoed where we're sharing folders between the guest and the host, this will greatly improve that experience. And then if you're using IE6, you obviously need to make sure you block the updates for 7 and 8. And if you're using 7, make sure you block 8. This should be fairly obvious, but it can be missed, and then you deploy your image and they get updated, and then you stop. You're not able to mitigate those websites. Disable system restore points. It's not necessary in your image, and it will just bloat that once it's on the endpoint device. And then there's this step here. Once you've created your image and you've got sysprep ready, you can mount it and use the disk manager to defrag. And then once you've defragged, you will use the command line utilities for Windows Virtual PC to compact the VHD, and that will sometimes give you a lot of savings, especially if you've deleted a lot of files off your image. That will greatly reduce the size. So these are kind of our best practices as you get your image ready to go to the packager. Okay? So sysprep. It may have been some time since some of you have looked at sysprep. If your XP images have been in the state they've been in for a long time, let's try to refresh you a little bit. So for the end user, when they get the image set up on their machine, you would like it to be as seamless as possible. So hopefully you're able to use the mini setup and have an answer file that will do everything for the user, input their license, have the domain password, all of those things. That's probably the ideal experience. Some of you may have specialized needs where you'll need the user to input something in the process, and you're able to do so, but we recommend you try to make it completely seamless to the user, and that is accomplished through the use of a sysprep.inf file or an answer file that you may be familiar with from Windows XP. And then we have a special utility, and this ships with the Medvi software, and once you install the host agent on the endpoint device, you'll have access to the FTS completion script. FTS stands for first time setup, and so this is the last thing that you want sysprep to run. And so what it does is first it adds the user to the RDS group. That's required for the remote app technology, the seamless technology for the end user. And if you choose to do so and need it, it can also add that user to the admin group in the Windows XP image if your applications require it. It then copies files to a location where you can pull them to do your, if you need to do reporting on that, and then it will tell Medvi that the process is complete and it will reboot the virtual machine. So that is an important step. So let's look at an example of a sysprep. Yes? It adds the user that's running the first time setup. So we'll talk about it in a second. There's another mode where you only run first time setup once, but in the normal state, every user that logs into a machine, we get a differencing disk on the machine, and they get their own instance of Windows XP. So it's private for that user. There's a way that you don't do it, and we'll talk about that in a second, but it's for the user as they're setting it up. Okay, so let's look at the sysprep file. Here's an example sysprep. It's probably a little hard to see here. It might be hard to zoom in on this as well. I didn't realize the res would be so big, but I'll call the things out here that are important. So these items here are the things that are absolutely required for Medvi. If you don't get these right, you input them wrong somehow, it will fail, and I'll point these out here. So what you've got is the administrator password for that XP image. You've got the domain username and password in that second group, and then finally you have the FTS completion, the specialized Medvi program at the bottom there. So these are absolutely required. When you do your testing, these are usually the most common places where things were failed because something went wrong here. These are the items that you can actually, for your convenience, these items can be copied from the host configuration and then implemented when the guest is set up on that machine. So if they're things specific for a user, like language, if they're things like the OU or the organization name, rather than having to have a special sysprep and Medvi image for each of those, you can have that information copied from the host system when it's set up. And then lastly, these are our best practices. These are the things where we found there are some gotchas here, so let's go through each of these. The first one, the command 0 that you see there, is the command to disable restore points. As we talked about, you want to keep that image lean, especially once it's been uncompressed and is being used by the user. You don't want that taking up too much disk space, and that can help. The second thing that's called there is the reset configuration manager client. So if you're using configuration manager, this will reset the GUID so that the space is unique and you can communicate with it. And then finally, the last one is an example reg file that will disable roaming user profiles. if you're using roaming user profiles, you want to make sure that it's disabled for the XP guest because you're already doing roaming user profiles likely for the host. And you don't want to do a double one because they're already sharing those files. So you want to make sure rep is disabled for that XP image. Okay? So moving forward, now we've got our image and it's ready to go. So we fire up the medv packager, and we'll do a demo of that in a moment. So the packager is the utility that you'll use to output the files that you'll use for deployment. And so in goes that XP image. It'll go into the workspace packager. You'll do your configurations around that, and it will output 3 files. Now remember these 3 files. So we've got a setup file, we've got an MSI file, and we've got the compressed Windows Virtual Machine VHD, the XP VHD. And those 3 files are what you will push to your endpoint devices to deploy that workspace. Also output will be a .reg file that include the configuration options that you had in the packager, as well as the PS1, the PowerShell files that were actually used to create the packages above. And so you can see from this diagram that there is a UI above it, but underneath, everything is being executed by PowerShell scripts. So if you have the right mind, or if you're doing a lot of workspace creations, you can script this and use PowerShell. And so the 2 files in below aren't required for deployment, but you can refer back to those if you decide to script it, if you want to use the advanced features in PowerShell. So those are the 5 files that you'll see output from the packager. So let's move now to the demo. Okay, so the packager, again, is just a standalone utility. You as the IT pro, the person that's going to create the package, you'll install it on a workstation, likely Windows 7 because you need Windows Virtual PC to create the image. So you'll likely be on a Windows 7 machine. It does require privileges when it's messing with the VHDs. It needs to have elevated rights. And so you're greeted here with a dashboard. And so the dashboard, you'll see, gives you these options. You create the workspace, and then it will give you 2 options to manage, which we'll talk about later in the presentation. Over to the right here, you'll see that there's step-by-step help that will guide you through the exact process that you need to follow to be successful in the packager, as well as a few other resources such as videos and the community site, etc. But today we're just going to go ahead and start with the workspace package creation. So the first thing we do is we're going to name our image. And I'll give you an example. In this case, we're going to call it TechEd Demo. And it will also create the corresponding folder where those 5 files will be output, and this will just be on your local system. I'll write what we have there. Now I'm going to choose my XP VHD, which has been created, sysprepped, etc. I'm going to pull it out here. Okay, so the next option that I have here is whether or not I want the user to see what's going on. So if you want it to be completely silent, to deploy these things and just have it go ahead and launch and have those applications ready, you can do so. Or you can actually give the user prompts, and you can let them know what's happening and give them the chance to delay the installation if you want, and we'll have a demo of that a little bit later. The next option, for most users, for knowledge workers, you probably have 1 user on that machine, and you don't need to worry about this option. This is just saying that they're going to have 1 unique system. But let me jump back to the presentation quickly, and let's talk about some shared scenarios. And this gentleman's question had a question about this earlier, and it may help answer it. So when you're in a shared situation, there's 2 options that you have. The first one is you can go ahead and use the default option, where each user that logs into that machine will get their own XP workspace. So you'll deploy 1 package, and each user that logs in will get a differencing disk off of that package, and that will be like their own Windows XP workspace. And if they have admin rights, only they will log into it, etc. The next user that comes along and logs in that system, that new differencing disk for that user in their environment will be created, and they'll have to go through first-time setup, and it will be theirs. And so if that's the situation, you don't have a lot of users logging into the system, maybe just a few, and it's the same users, then that's probably the way to go. If, on the other hand, you have a situation where you have task workers, and you have common use machines, and there's a lot of users going and logging into that system, and you don't want to have them be delayed with a first-time setup, then you can go with this option where you get a common XP workspace. And the first user that logs into that machine will have to run through FTS, but each subsequent users will actually log in and use that workspace just the normal accounting in XP. And so that would be a problem if you give them admin rights. They might be able to look at each other's files and do things that way. So that's one thing to be careful of if you do choose this option. So this is just for shared computers. If you're just using standard, one user and one machine, then you just go with the default option, which is already selected. Okay, so on the next page, make sure I didn't miss a step here. And then finally, this is the option that would allow you to have Medvi automatically add users to the admin group if you choose to have them do so, and that is off by default. These will be the messages. If you want the user to have a prompt before Medvi is going to start, you can give them a message. You can link to a site on your IT help desk site, etc. You can let the user know what's happening, or you just hide that completely from the user. In this one, so naming is an important thing. So you're going to potentially have a second machine on this user's machine, and maybe if there's a second computer logged in, you'll have another one on that machine, and so the naming needs to be unique. You need to be able to identify those Medvi workspaces so that you can deploy software to them, understand where they are and what they are. And so you can come up with your own conventions for that, but we have a feature with a bunch of pre-filled options where you can actually take things like the host name of the machine, the user's name, random fill. You can put custom things in that, and that'll actually create the name for you so that it's unique and there's not going to be collision. So in this case, I'm going to take a combination of my username and my host name. And you can see it'll graphically show you what we're using and then give you an example based on the machine that I'm logged into as the packager and the user that I am, and that will show you what it will look like. And so that's an important thing to make sure that workspace is unique. These are the copy of the settings. So remember earlier in the sysprep file, you had the ability to copy those settings. This is where you make sure that that was done. And then finally, these are some of the major settings. So we had talked about the fast start and the normal start. This is where that would be configured. You can turn that off by policy, and if you want to enforce one way or the other. It's the networking option, so most users will choose NAT mode. But if you have special networking needs, you can choose bridged on this step. And then finally, you can prevent, if you choose to do so, from allowing your users to store their XP Medvi workspace credentials in CredMan and Windows 7, which would mean every time it starts up, they would be prompted. They would have to enter their username and password. And then finally, let's talk a little bit about web redirections. So we showed you the user demo, and this is where you would actually fill in your URL. So let's take a look at this slide. So you've seen the demo and you know what it does. So you as the IT pro, you'll define the websites that won't work on Windows 8 or Windows 9 in the host. And as those users access those sites in those host browsers, that will automatically redirect them based on your policy into the guest browser of your choice, be it IE6 or IE7. And so you can see this is how in the administration packager tool, you have the option to do things such as wildcards. You can call paths to URLs, pages directly. You can even do ports if you need to, and so you can read documentation on exactly how you'd manage that, depending how complex and how many sites you're actually redirecting. So once I've included that, and these are my security options. If I want to have that real secure browser, don't have the address bar showing, I would select these. We have that on by default. We want to protect our customers and make sure that they're not compromising anything they don't want to. And then we'll move to a summary screen that allow me to review everything that I configured. And then finally, we will kick off the creation process. So while that's happening, I have my colleague here that's got some giveaways here. If anyone can tell me one of the 5 files that the packager is going to output before it finishes here, go ahead and call them out. What do you got? What did you say right here? There's an MSI right here, Tim. What else? Right here. A PowerShell script. Got it. What else? We got 3 more. The .reg file. He got it. Way in the back. You got to yell. I've got 2 more. It's a VHD file, but what is it? After it's compressed, what's it called? Close. What are we in? What session are we in? The .medv file. And then last one. Yes. The exe right in the front. If we don't have another one, we'll get one for you. All right, that's right. Oh, wow, it just finished. Okay, so there you can see that those are the 3 output files. And the 3 that are important for your deployment will be the .exe file, which wraps the MSI, which wraps the .medv, and then the other 2, the one file, and the reg file are for your reference. Great. All right, so let's move back. All right, so now we've looked at the packager. We know what our files are, and let's talk a little bit more about deployment. So the V1 product, for those of you that might be familiar with it, it had infrastructure that had to be stood up. There was an image server, there was a policy server, there was a logging server. That's gone with V2. So we heard our customers, and we understand that they just wanted to deploy it just like a software package and not have to put servers in place and infrastructure in place to manage and deploy MedV. And so it's going to be managed just like you would any other application. So let's look at the inventory. So first thing we need, you need to install Windows Virtual PC on your endpoint device. Now let's talk for a moment about hardware-assisted virtualization. That's a technology that a lot of your newer machines have, but by default, they ship with it turned off in the BIOS. So if you have an older machine that doesn't have HAV, or if you have a fleet of machines that have been deployed where you didn't turn that on in the BIOS, you need to make sure that you install the non-HAV patch for Windows Virtual PC so that it will run. If you don't install this patch and run Windows Virtual PC on one of those machines where it's not enabled or it doesn't have hardware-assisted virtualization, it will not install or run. So you need to make sure that if you need that, and most will, that you have that ready to go. From the MedV side, you'll have the host agent, and then, of course, our famous 3 files that our packager just output for us. And those are really the inventory of the files that you'll need to deploy. Question here in the front. So the question was, how much does HAV improve the performance? You'll have to try to test in your own organization. I don't know that I have benchmarks, but just from my gut feel, it's maybe Tim can help me, 10 to 15%. It really depends on how old the system is and how much memory you have. If you have a lot of memory in that system, you'd probably be okay. Come talk to us a little more and we can give you a little more details. We don't have the real specific scientific numbers, but it does improve. It certainly does make a difference. Okay? So the methods of deployment. So there are 4 methods. The first will be your user-initiated. This will be your lab and your proof of concept. You'll take those files and you'll install manually. You can send them to someone else to install, and that's how you'll deploy them initially. But most of you have an ESD. You're using an ESD to manage and deploy your software, and that's where MedV will shine for you. One point to point out is VPC does require a reboot. So when you create your scripts and the way you deploy it, you want to make sure that you can get everything installed before you reboot, so you only have one reboot for the user, and we'll talk about that in a moment. If you're using Config Manager and you're a Config Manager customer, we love it, and we've actually added some enhancements to improve the experience if you do use Config Manager. So of course we have the ability to create collections, and you want to do that with your MedV virtual machine so you understand what those are and you can target those devices directly. And then for all the files and all the steps that we have, so you want to make sure that use AppB as well. And one of the great improvements that we made for MedV v2 is the fact that if you have a NAT machine, and using NAT mode, and most are for networking, that CM client that's installed can communicate with the CM server. And so that was an improvement that was made over v1, and that's really not only applies to Configuration Manager, but will apply to all standard DSDs. Yes? You'll have to create a collection around it. So the question was, will the virtual machines show up as virtual machines for Config Manager? In the total inventory? So I think in Config Manager they'll show up just as normal machines, but you can actually make sure that those are collections so you can manage them separately. Tomorrow morning at 8:30, one of my colleagues here in the front row is actually going to do an interactive session where we're going to talk about a MedV deployment using Configuration Manager. And if you're doing that or if you're considering that, come to that session. It's early. You're here late, and that session's early. We apologize for that, but come and we can talk a little bit more about Configuration Manager and MedV. All right? So moving on. So the last option is you can configure it as part of your Windows 7 image. You can actually put the bits in that image that you deploy to all of your devices. So really, this is going to be reserved for those that know that everyone's going to need it in their organization. Or we have some customers that use it as insurance. So if they don't have the time to actually inventory and know all the applications they're going to need and who's going to need it, they can include it in the image that they're deploying on their new machines or upgrading their old machines. And it can lie dormant until the user decides that they need it or that they have an application that needs mitigation or a whole department, and then you can make sure that the install gets completed and they have MEDV available. So this is another option if you don't know how many people are going to be using it, or if you know your whole org is going to use it, they might as well have it in your image. So we'll talk a little bit more about that and get into some detail. So on the end user side, so once it's been deployed and the host agent's set up and the workspace gets installed, you'll get a run key for the MEDV host. So each user that logs into the system, the MEDV host will start, and the first thing the MEDV host will check for is whether or not first-time setup's been run. If it hasn't been run, then it will go ahead and happen. And what happens is, the first thing the user will ask for their domain credentials. So the same domain credentials that they're using on the host will have to be done in the guest, but due to the security restrictions, we can't pull those over and make it a single sign-on. So to maintain the security integrity, they're going to have to input those, and they can save it if you choose to allow that by policy, and they won't have to enter it again. So the differencing disk then is created for every user that's using MEDV, unless you're using the shared option that we talked about, where only one differencing disk for the whole machine is being used. It'll run mini setup to complete the complete operation. FTS will then be called, and then once that's all finished, the user will get a prompt that their applications are ready, and their applications will be in the start menu, and the web redirections ready to go. So that's what happens on the end user side. So let's look at a deployment example for Config Manager. So you'll get your inventory, you'll have all those packages ready to go, and you'll either create a new task sequence just for MEDV, or you integrate with one that exists, or maybe you don't use task sequences and you use batch scripts or whatever it is you do. You'll have that ready to go. You'll then create an advertisement for those target machines. Those target machines will then pick up the advertisement, and off they'll go through the process that was described previously. On the user side, it's the same thing. It'll be installed silently, VPC. It'll install the MEDV host and all of those things, and then they'll get a reboot at the very end. So that's important to note that they'll have to reboot. And then once the user reboots, they'll be prompted for their domain credentials. FTS will be completed, and they'll be notified once they're ready to roll. When you do it through a Windows 7 image, it'll be a little different. As you're creating your image, you'll install Windows Virtual PC and all the prerequisites that you're going to need. You'll install the MEDV host agent, but then you'll stop. You will not install the workspace because that needs to be done uniquely for that machine. So what you'll actually do is copy all those 3 files we talked about to a location on that image, and then once it's deployed to the endpoint device, you can either create a shortcut or have documentation or inform your help desk that if a user needs MEDV, they'll need to install the workspace packager. It's just a single exe that we talked about. You execute that. It's a couple of screens and an MSI. It'll prompt the user to launch setup. It'll launch setup. It'll run through FTS, and then once that's completed, the user is ready to roll. So just a little bit different when you do it in a Windows 7 image. So let's take a look at a short demo that we have around deployment. Okay? We'll close the packager. So the first thing I want to do here is show you on the media. So this is what you'll actually have. The first is your host agent, and the second would be the workspace packager, which is the admin demo that I showed you previously. These are the only 2 files you'll need. There's a bootstrapper in them that will determine bitness, and we'll install them on 32 or 64 depending on where they're being installed. So these are the only things that you need to worry about from the MEDV side. Fortunately, Windows Virtual PC does not do bitness, so I've created a little example here. And let me get in tighter on this for you. In this example, I've created what it might look like as you prepare and get the inventory of files for a 64-bit ESD deployment. And so you can see that I have my necessary MEDV files for the packager and the agent, so the 3 files plus the agent. And then for Windows Virtual PC, the first one that you'll see there, let me zoom back out here, I got that. The first one you should see there is the actual Windows Virtual PC package. The second one is the non-HAV patch that we talked about earlier that many of you will need. And so with that, you'll go ahead and deploy. Let me show you what the deployment script will look like, and I'll point out a few things here. So if we look at this example bat file, you'll notice that the first thing that we do is install the MEDV host agent. So what we found from our customers is that sometimes, due to the big MEDV file and the time it took to transfer it, is that they would have a problem where the system would reboot before it finished. And so the MEDV host agent generally is going to check to make sure that Windows Virtual PC is installed before allowing the install to proceed. So in those cases where you're using an ESD and you're having that problem because it's taking too long to copy some of the files and they're not there in time, if you use the ignore prerequisite switch, it will ignore the fact that Windows Virtual PC is not installed. Go ahead and finish the installation. You'll then kick off your Windows Virtual PC installation and just have that one reboot. Well, that's something to watch out for as you prepare your deployments. Okay, I'm going to jump over now to an actual end-user machine, and we'll take a look. Let's see. And we'll take a look at what the experience could be like for a user that's getting an ESD deployment of Medb. So in this case, I'm going to manually launch the host agent, but remember that is in the run key. So when the user logs in, or if they're already logged in, it's going to be launched for them. So I'm going to contrive that and go ahead and launch it. This is on a Hyper-V machine. We're running virtual and a virtual, so. Okay, so we see that the user gets this. Now this is one of the prompts that I said was optional that I called out in the packager. If you want the user to be informed, and because that reboot's required, if you want them to have a choice whether or not that reboot takes place, you can give them this prompt. And we've designed it to look and act very similar to your Windows Update prompt, where you get a pull down and you can postpone for a certain amount of time. But again, this is optional. You can make it completely silent for the user and they won't have to see this, but I did want to show it to you here. So I'm going to go ahead and start this. And so after that happens, what will we see? We'll see that domain. Remember, we cannot use single sign-on just because of the differences in security layers between the old technology and the new. And so the user will have to input their password at this point. So I will demo that if I input the wrong password and try to save it. Let that catch up, Hyper-V. Come on, Hyper-V. There it is. That it will actually check to make sure that it is the right password so they don't end up saving the wrong password and then they get in a loop wondering what the heck is wrong, why it's not saving it. So I'll dismiss that and then input the right one. And away it goes. And so that'll spin around. Remember, it's going to do all those things that we set up. It'll do your sysprep.inf. If you've got that fully automated, it's going to join to the domain and do all the things that it needs. As soon as it's done, the user will get a notification that their applications are ready. Those will be published to the start menu, and they'll be ready to rock. Go ahead, sir. I didn't click remember. If I didn't click remember my password, the next time around that the workspace was restarted, so if you're doing the hibernation, it will ask you after it comes out of hibernation, or if you're doing if you're doing the fast start, next time you reboot or had to shut down the virtual machine, like it got an update, say, then it would ask for it again. So each time, not every time they launch an app, but every time they establish that RDP connection to do the seamless mode, it will ask for it. So if you have a 90-day policy on your password and it expires, they will get the prompt again. So it's not correct to say that they'll never see it again. They'll see it each time their password changes. So if you have a 90-day policy, at day 90 they change the password in the host, they'll have to put it back in Cred Manager for the guest. And that is a tested scenario, and we have some enhancements around that to make sure it's the best experience possible for the user. So that is a great question, sir. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump back here and let's wrap up. See if we can get you out here a little bit early. So for finally now, we've gone through, created our image. We went and put it in the packager and got the files we needed for deployment, and now let's talk about now that you have Medb out there, now what? So the first thing, we've already discussed this, you're likely going to deploy your image to keep it small and tight, and because you don't know what people are going to need, you'll likely deploy it without applications in it. And as we've discussed in the architecture and throughout the discussion here, you'll be able to install applications in the XP3 virtual machine guest, and those applications will be seamlessly published to the host start menu. And that can be, the same would apply when you need to revoke an application because it's been mitigated. Maybe it's been updated already on the host with a native version. You can revoke those in the same process. They'll be pulled out of the start menu and off of the guest. So you'll manage those the same way as you add new ones and remove them. They'll be very similar to managing a physical machine. We have a great feature as well if you happen to do the normal start, where it's in hibernation mode, and you have users that maybe only look at it once a month, and that machine is always hibernated. You want to make sure that it's secure, that the protection software can run, that it can get the patches it needs, and so you as an administrator can do a wake to patch for that machine so that it's woken up at on a certain interval, receives the patches it needs, and then it returns to hibernation. So this is just insurance for those users that aren't using it frequently if you're using normal start to make sure that they stay up to date. So we took a look at the packager. Here's the UI again, and we looked at the create package feature, but below that you see that there are two manage things. One of them will actually, let me see if I can get in on this one. This one actually isn't going to have Zoom for me, so I'm not going to be able to show it. I can go over to here. It's really hard to see. Okay. So the first one there is you can go back and you can manage your web redirections. So everything's done through the registry. So many of you may just decide, I can manage that, and you'll go and you'll update the area in the registry where we maintain the list of sites that are redirected to IE6. If you'd like to, however, you can return to this site, and it will pull up the UI just for web redirection. You can do a modification, and it will output a reg file that you can then deploy to your endpoints. The second one are the settings we talked about, NAT mode, fast start, and those other options. And if you choose, those are all again in the registry, and if you choose to go back to the UI here to use them, they'll output a reg file, and the same process will happen. So that's what I'm showing here. You'll see they'll all be saved as a reg file, but everything is managed through the registry, and you might have mechanisms that better ways to manage this today. Another great feature, and this is one that I've been showing people in the booth. We have MedV users that come and may have difficulty troubleshooting. This is a great thing for you or for your help desk. If you're having problems, you can run the host agent here with that /toolkit option, and it will pop a UI, and it'll give you access to some of the most common troubleshooting tasks that we've found that our users will need. So for example, you can change the logging level to get more verbose logs. You can launch the event viewer in both the host and the guest to look at log files. You can restart the MedV workspace. You can run the workspace in full screen mode to do troubleshooting. You can get a list of the published applications on that machine or a list of all the redirected websites. And then we have a great feature if you're finding that you're having trouble with the workspace and you've spent enough time troubleshooting it. It's our atomic option, our red button. It will kill that differencing disk. It'll reset to FTS and just start over again. And the user won't be saving critical data in that workspace, and off they go if they do have critical problems. So this is an important thing to keep in mind. I have a question over here. This is a client application. So the MedV host agent, you would call it with that switch if it's been installed on an endpoint device on that client, and that would pop. So you normally probably wouldn't direct users to do this. It would just be for help desk scenarios. Yes? Yeah. The question was, could this information be retrieved, say, through WMI? These particular things are not available through WMI at this time. Okay. So as we wrap up here, we're going to get you out here a little bit early. I just wanted to call out another one of our great customers. So you saw Royal Caribbean worked with us, but Applied Materials, they came to us in our TAP program and were with us through beta. And these were one of our customers that they did not have the budget or the time to get a hold of all of their applications to understand what they needed mitigated. And so they took the approach of insurance that we've talked about, where they actually put MedV in their Windows 7 image that they were deployed. And as problems came up, as they found applications that needed mitigation, then they would direct their users to install it and to run it, and they would publish those applications and websites and get things going. They found it was invaluable. They were able to move to Windows 7 quickly, and they're right now in the process of getting off of XP altogether. And so we had a great experience with both Jim and Pat in that regard. So just to wrap it up, this will be the last thing we talk about. So as you are testing your applications, We already had the raise of hands. Everyone has found that they have difficult applications, things that are preventing them from moving. And what Medvi does is it will mitigate those difficult applications, allow you to upgrade to Windows 7 today and unblock your deployment, and you can spend the rest of your time figuring out how you're going to mitigate those apps, but move today and realize the benefits. So with that, that's the conclusion. We'll open up the question and answers. Before we get into that, I just want to point out the interactive session, which is the third box up here. I already called it out. My colleague here in the front row will be holding an interactive session to discuss deployment of Medvi through Configuration Manager. And if you're up at 8:30 tomorrow, if you're not out too late at the parties tonight, please join us. It'll be in Building B 306. And we'll be there at 8:30. You can bring your regular Medvi questions too. If you don't have Configuration Manager or you're not concerned about deployment, please come. Tomorrow morning at 8:30 a.m. So pretty bright and early. So we know we got a dedicated crowd here. Thank you so much for coming out tonight and staying here late. I hope you guys have a great evening, and please visit us tomorrow morning. Got a question up here. Do you want to step to a mic, sir? Or? We don't have to be so formal, I guess. There's not many of us.
So you deploy applications through SECM to the XP virtual machine?
Yes.
Does the VHD dynamically grow then?
Of course. So,
okay, so
yeah, it uses
is there a limitation on it?
There wouldn't be a limitation. I mean, I'm sure there's a very high upper limitation, but none of our customers would reach it.
Okay.
You'd have to install a lot of apps.
Well, it'd be limited to how big you created that virtual disk.
That's right. Probably the hard drive. I mean, I'm sure there's a mathematical limitation, but that's right. A physical hard drive would be the limitation.
Can you open that workspace so that end users can install apps? So what we have is we have a lot of transparent apps that we don't own as IT.
Right.
They're the troubled ones, the line of business we know about.
Yeah.
So how do you publish that desktop so they can see it and interact with it?
Let me just start and say that that's not supported, that it's really not designed to run in a mode that a user would interact with in full screen mode and install applications. It is based on Windows Virtual PC. So those workspaces that you do install, you can direct your users to open them in full screen mode. And if they have admin privileges, they can go ahead and install applications and pull files into it, and it would work. It's just not a supported scenario for Medvi.
Like if IE6, you go to a site that requires like an ActiveX,
right?
Would they be able to install that ActiveX?
Depending on the security controls, they would be able to install Active. They're an admin, right? So I think the gentleman's question here was more along the lines of they had an MSI that they want to self-publish, right?
Yeah, we have thousands of those apps, so we need.
So I mean, if you use XP mode, it's the same plumbing, and so you'll be able to take that workspace that you've deployed, direct a user how to open it in full screen mode, and they'll be able to do it. They can even publish them to their start menu if they want. It would be very similar to that standalone product XP mode.
But XP mode isn't managed though, right?
XP mode's not managed, but the point I'm making here is if you have Medvi that's deployed to your enterprise, but you have a few power users that want to install their own apps, they can treat it like XP mode. You wouldn't necessarily support it, or we wouldn't, but it would work.
And then the other question for Medvi, would you put antivirus and all your other corporate?
Yeah.
So that's a best practice. You'd put all that in there.
So we don't make many bones about it. You are doubling the surface that you're managing. You know, you're going to have your physical host, and then you're going to have that guest that really is treated like a physical machine. And so we've tried to put tools in place to make that easier, but you are managing full desktop there, and you shouldn't have your endpoint protection.
Okay, thank you.
Because it is open to the internet.
If you publish an internet-facing application, you just publish the access.
Yes.
You wouldn't need antivirus on that.
Yeah. I mean, there are situations where maybe you just treat it like it's physical. If the physical wouldn't have it, then you wouldn't have to do it in the virtual. Yes.
Is it possible to run one of the Medvi sessions off of a removable device? As part of our DR, we have to be able to set up an environment that doesn't have a network. So can that be done?
Unfortunately, not a supported scenario. Being able to run it off a USB device would not be supported.
So you mind if I ask my question first?
Go right ahead.
So the question was, would our customers prohibit direct access to virtual PC like in the scenario what the gentleman in the green shirt described? Yeah, so one thing that you would do is you could obscure and take the virtual PC start item out of the start menu, because really that's how they'd access it. I could show you here if you're interested. Or you could come up later. Yeah. I don't know, maybe Tim has another answer. Is there any way to make that more secure so that the users can't get out the full screen mode? Yeah, we got a small group here now. Did that help you at all? Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, you're right. Thanks, Tim. Looks like you have a question here.
If you have sequenced apps that you've already sequenced under XP,
Yes.
does it make sense to try and resequence those apps for 7, or can we just use the AppV app
Yeah,
under
so I
MedV?
had someone in the booth ask me this question today. It was a medical facility where they had to archive versions of applications, and they had amassed like 20,000, like just an amazing amount of AppV sequenced apps. And he was asking me, well, do they have to resequence those to work on Windows 7? And I said, of course. But a great solution for them is to actually use those sequenced apps in a MedV workspace because they'll all work. So it would depend. I mean, you don't want to be dependent on MedV forever, right? So if it's a mitigation thing like we've talked about where there's a gap and they don't have the time to go back and resequence those, then great. Maybe it will give them what they need to get to Windows 7, and that's would be great. But if they're going to rely on that long term, then I would say, get the right version, sequence it for Windows 7, because you're going to get the security benefits and everything that you get with Windows 7. So really, you'd have to understand the use case better, but my general recommendation would be it to be a short-term solution.
I'd like to know if it's recommended, or if you've heard this, where you use the P2V utility.
Yes, physical to virtual.
To create the VHD that will then go into the MedV workspace.
That was something that we considered, I think, early on in our process, and I think with the time frames that we had to ship, to get it out, it was something that we discarded early, and I think it's just because it's more complicated than what we have here. There are driver issues, and there's some concerns. Maybe it's not ready for prime time. That being said, you can try to do it. You can try to do a small pilot in your company and see if it suits your needs. We wouldn't recommend or support it. Go ahead, David.
That solution was kind of based on the fact that each user would take an existing XP hard drive and convert it. That's a one save you some time building your VHD? Cool, use it. But it's not designed, again, to be a one-to-one relationship.
Right.
Ideally, my VHD should be the same base VHD he uses, and then through the VSD we determine if he's in marketing, we may get some special line business apps, and if I'm in sales, I may get some special line business apps. But I have one image to manage, one ID.
So the one problem you'll have is that you have to create a package for each one of those physicals you converted to virtual, and that could get pretty complicated.
Well,
when you're
our
talking about
particular scenario is we know that we have multiple lines of business, and
Yeah.
that they get a hold of one of our deployments that we've shaped and baked for them really nicely,
Right.
and then they start doing stuff on top of it, and that's what they really use. That's what they really need. So our thought was, why don't we give them a laptop or something, tell them to really make it theirs, and then we'll take that P2V it, and whenever we roll out Windows 7 with them, we've got their specialized line of business MedV workspace that will go out with that.
Yeah, I mean, the product, like we've talked about, just really wasn't designed. The workflow would be a nightmare. I mean, you'd have to take that image, put it in the packager. I mean, there's PowerShell and things, and like I said, you could probably cobble something together, but we just haven't really taken that scenario into account as we've created the VT product.
Well, it sounds like it should work, because it's just a matter of, okay, whenever I'm deploying in this task sequence, the MDT database will just say, okay, you're supposed to get these applications. Well, according, one of the many applications will be, this flavor of VHD. The next line of business deployment, it'll be the next flavor of VHD.
Well, take for example, I mean, this is where physical virtual gets a little confusing. If you did physical virtual hard drive with MedV, one of the values that MedV adds is that we place all the applications in the start menu in context to the start menu.
Right.
So what's going to happen now is suddenly I'm going to have duplicate entries for anything I migrated and have a ton of collisions in my start menu. Where the way it's designed to run, and this is by design with Windows Virtual PC and XP mode, it puts them all into a virtual applications mode. So the user goes in there and uses them. So I guess to your point, go ahead and use a physical to virtual, but don't muddy the waters by saying numeric with MedV. You might use it. That virtual PC and XP mode are great solutions. It just depends on what you're trying to accomplish and if I need that enterprise level management for some of this. I would argue that if you're doing the physical virtual stuff that you're talking about, I'd probably make that a domain joined image. I wouldn't recommend it across the enterprise, because if you're trying to make power users who have specific apps and I'm trying to innovate, and I'd love to use it in just VPC and manage it accordingly. Because XP Mode, I understand, is a CAN XP image. They don't support outside of that. Anything beyond that puts you into kind of virtual PC on your own world anyway. So kind of think through how this works. I mean, we'll be glad to talk more with you about it at the booth and stuff over the next few days.
Okay.
For the session tomorrow morning as well at 8:30?
Yeah, we'll be there.
Yeah.
Okay.
One other quick question, if I could, please. You said that the admin password is required, during the creation.
Right.
It's got to be in there.
Right.
Well, what if, after it's domain joined, after it comes in, we rename the administrator account and we're going to change the password? We do this for all of our domain join PCs. Is it required after that?
After that, they've run setup. It's
The
not.
FTS.
After they run FTS, it's the only time it's going to use it.
Okay,
When
so
the
we should be
workspace is set
safe.
up, right? And they go through the domain join process after that's done, and it's just like a physical deployment. You can
Okay,
change it. No problem.
that sounds good.
But if you do change your admin password, your images could get stale, right? And that's one thing that you should consider. You'll have to go back and repackage it if you do change it to get the right INF file in there.
In order to remove, like we were saying, it publishes to the start menu. If we want to remove, we've mitigated a particular application,
Okay.
and we want to remove it from the XP MedV. Can we just say, okay, just remove it from the start menu, or do we need to really uninstall it?
There is a way, so the way the publishing works, you can look at the specific documentation, but you put the shortcuts in the all users location, and that's how you really publish it.
Yeah.
And so you could just pull that icon out of the all users
Okay.
folder and it would be gone.
But it won't query it again and put it back out there.
That's correct.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
It'll be
yeah.
gone for good. Once
A lot
that-
of the apps that we do, 40% of them or something, they've got these really strange. I mean, we're doing good just to get them installed.
And the only problem that
And to
I've-
uninstall them, completely is an absolute nightmare.
and the only
So-
problem that I've seen is something like Silverlight. If you get an update to Silverlight for whatever reason, it's a shortcut in this place that we're talking about that publishes it.
Right.
And a lot of administrators will pull that out of MedV. And if they get an update, the stupid thing gets put back in.
Oh, yeah.
But there's not many that do that. Silverlight is the one gotcha if you have Silverlight installed. Oh yeah.
Okay.
That's a great point. Yeah. And then,
Gotcha.
then they're ignored no matter what happens.
Sounds
Slide
like I got
deck's
some more
gonna be
reading.
online?
Then.
Excuse me?
The slide deck's going to be online.
The slide deck's already online.
Thank you.
Get that.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much.